The forest stood still under the early morning fog, its dense canopy veiling the sky in a muted gray light. The air was thick with the scent of pine, moss, and earth, each breath bringing a sharp chill to the lungs. Beyond the reach of civilization, a lone figure moved, clothed in weathered gear, boots heavy with mud from the night's rain. The forest was the domain of wildlife, silent, mysterious, and untamed. Evan, a seasoned wildlife photographer, had been tracking an elusive species of deer for days. The elusive creature had become a legend among the local rangers, a rare and beautiful animal few had ever seen. Today, he felt a strange certainty that he might finally catch sight of it. His instincts, honed from years of observing the natural world, told him that the forest was alive with a hidden rhythm, a path that the deer had taken many times before. He made his way deeper into the wilderness, eyes scanning the ground for signs of the animal. Fresh tracks, no larger than his palm, crisscrossed the damp earth, delicate as lace. The forest had a strange quiet to it, the usual rustle of small creatures muted as though the woods were holding their breath. Even the breeze seemed to have stopped. The trees around him loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches twisted and heavy with dew. Every sound, the soft shuffle of his boots, the distant croak of a raven, was amplified in the stillness. Evan moved carefully, his camera slung low at his side, his eyes ever watchful. The deer's path was becoming clearer now, the tracks winding toward a hollow where the trees grew thick and close, their trunks gnarled with age. He paused at the edge of the clearing, listening intently. A sudden movement, a flicker of motion caught his attention. At the far side of the clearing, hidden in a tangle of ferns, something shifted. His heart raced. It was just a fleeting shadow, but in that moment, Evan's breath caught. It was the deer. For a few moments, everything stood still. The world was suspended, and Evan's senses were sharpened, his body frozen as he stared into the undergrowth. He knew that making a move too soon would drive it away. Instead, he settled into the silence, focusing on the space between him and the deer. His heart beat louder than ever, and he was aware of his every breath. His camera felt like a heavy weight in his hands, almost too much to bear in this stillness. Suddenly, a rustle from behind, a crack of a branch underfoot. Evan tensed. He dared not turn, but instinctively knew that the sound had come from somewhere deeper in the forest. The deer had not been alone. Someone else was nearby. The atmosphere shifted. A chill ran up his spine. He slowly lowered himself into the underbrush, crouching low to the ground, trying to blend into the shadows. The stillness felt suffocating now, too quiet, as if the forest itself had shifted into a different state. His eyes darted between the trees, searching for any sign of movement. The deer was gone. Had it been a figment of his imagination? Or had it seen him? But then the unmistakable sound of hooves against the forest floor broke the silence, faint but distinct. Evan held his breath, barely daring to move as he strained his ears. The sound was faint at first, rhythmic, a steady beat that echoed through the trees. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the deer was still near. But this was no ordinary creature, no simple wanderer. The sound grew louder and faster, but it was coming closer. Not from the clearing, but from behind him. A shift in the atmosphere told him something was amiss. The usual sounds of the forest had become warped. The wind, once gentle, now carried with it an eerie, unnatural quality, as if it were being tugged by an unseen force. Evan's thoughts scrambled, but one thing was clear. He had to leave, now. He turned, his movements swift but controlled, heading back toward the path he had come. The sound of hooves quickened, now unmistakably charging, echoing behind him. The trees closed in around him as he navigated the darkening woods, branches grabbing at his clothes, the weight of the forest pressing down on him. He glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. He heard only the pounding of his own footsteps, A relief momentarily, but it was short-lived. The feeling of being hunted lingered, growing stronger with each passing second. Then, the scream of a bird cut through the air. A cry so harsh and shrill it nearly knocked him off his feet. The world seemed to blur, the line between reality and nightmare narrowing. His eyes darted frantically. The deer, no, something else, had emerged from the shadows, standing still but somehow moving with an unnatural presence, its pale eyes glowing faintly in the dimming light. It was standing on the path ahead of him, blocking his escape. Evan stood motionless, unsure if this was the deer he had sought for so long or something else entirely. Its fur shimmered strangely in the fog, its features too sharp, too perfect. It looked at him with an intelligence that surpassed any animal he had seen before. The forest around him seemed to pulse with an unseen force, the trees bending inwards, the ground beneath his feet trembling slightly. The wind stilled. Then, without warning, the creature bolted, darting into the forest with terrifying speed, vanishing into the night like a shadow swallowed by the trees. A sudden crash of branches behind him sent Evan stumbling forward. The path was gone. The trees had shifted. He spun around, realizing the woods had changed. He was no longer where he had been moments before. The once familiar trail was now a twisted labyrinth, the forest unfamiliar, alien even. He had been led somewhere else, deeper into the heart of the wilderness than he had ever been. The deer's path had been a lure. The fog thickened around him, the world closing in. Something had claimed the forest, something that had watched him from the shadows. He was not alone anymore. In the distance, the faintest outline of the creature reappeared, no longer the graceful deer he had imagined, but something far darker, something that had always belonged here. And Evan knew, as he stood at the edge of the forest, that the woods had taken its toll. Evan's breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of realization pressed down on him. He was no longer a mere observer, a silent witness to nature's beauty. He had become a part of it, tangled in its deep, unfathomable web. The forest around him seemed to throb with an ancient, pulsing energy, as if the very trees, the earth beneath him, and the fog swirling in the air had a consciousness of their own. The air had grown thick with tension, each step Evan took sinking deeper into the confusion of the shifting woods. The trail he had followed was now invisible, swallowed by the darkening landscape. The path, which had once been so clear, marked by the delicate prints of the elusive deer, was gone, obscured by the tangled roots and underbrush that had grown unchecked in the thickening mist. He stood in silence, trying to still the rising panic inside him. His eyes darted through the trees, seeking any sign of the creature that had lured him into this strange, unknown part of the forest. His instincts told him that it wasn't just the deer he needed to fear, but something older, something far more elusive. The quiet of the woods seemed to hum with an unseen presence, watching, waiting. A sudden crack of a distant branch caught his attention. His head snapped around. There, just beyond the reach of his fading vision, something shifted. A dark, hulking shape moving between the trees. It was too large to be a deer, too silent to be a bear, and yet the way it moved was fluid, unnaturally so, as if the very earth bent to its will. For a moment, Evan froze. His instincts screamed at him to move, to run, to escape this place, but his legs refused to obey. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to know he was there, its gaze heavy on him even though it remained hidden in the fog. He could almost feel its eyes on his back, like a weight pressing down on him. Then a movement from the corner of his eye. Another figure, smaller, more graceful, slipping through the trees. It was the deer, but it was different now too. Its body shimmered like a wisp of smoke in the fog, its eyes glowing softly as it paused in the distance. It stood motionless, staring at him, the very embodiment of the forest's haunting beauty. But there was something wrong about it. Its stance was too still, too deliberate, as though it were waiting for him to make the first move. Evan's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the creature. Something in the way it stood spoke to him, a silent command, an invitation, or perhaps a warning. The forest around him had become a trap, its trees closing in, its paths no longer a means of escape but part of the snare. His hand instinctively reached for his camera, the only thing that had kept him tethered to the world of the living, the world of logic and reason. He knew he had to document this, whatever this was. But as his fingers brushed the camera's lens, something in the distance shifted again. The larger figure, the one that had moved with unnatural fluidity, emerged from the trees, its shape now unmistakable. It was a stag, but not a normal one. Its antlers were impossibly long, twisting in a pattern that resembled gnarled roots, curling and reaching into the sky like an ancient tree's branches. Its eyes were empty black voids, yet they seemed to draw him in, as if they could see straight through him. The stag's massive hooves lifted from the ground in slow, deliberate movements, each step echoing through the forest with a hollow, eerie sound. As it walked toward Evan, the very air seemed to change, thickening, pressing in on him. The deer, still standing in the distance, had vanished into the fog, leaving only the stag as the lone figure in the woods. The tension in the air grew unbearable. The stag's presence seemed to distort everything around it, the trees, the fog, the earth itself, twisting reality until Evan couldn't tell where the forest ended and the creature began. A deep, vibrating hum filled his ears, almost like the sound of a distant chant, something ancient and primal. The forest was alive, but not in the way he had ever known. It was breathing, shifting, moving with a life of its own. Evan stumbled back, his legs shaky, but the forest had become a maze. Every direction seemed to lead deeper into the unknown. There was no way out. The stag continued to advance, its hooves sinking into the earth with every step. The ground trembled beneath him as if it were reacting to the creature's power, though the world around him seemed to blur, and he suddenly felt an overwhelming weight on his chest, as if the forest itself were closing in, pressing him into the ground. The stag's presence was suffocating, like an invisible hand clutching at his throat. Evan tried to move, tried to run, but his body betrayed him. He was rooted in place, caught in the grip of something far older and more powerful than himself. The stag loomed closer, its black eyes now inches from his face, and in that moment, he understood. The creature wasn't simply an animal, it was a guardian, a being that controlled the very life of the forest, a force that had been here long before he ever set foot in these woods. The forest had never been just trees and wildlife. It was a living, breathing entity, and Evan had trespassed too far into its heart. The deer, the path, had led him here for a reason, not to capture an image, but to witness an ancient cycle, a truth hidden from the world. The stag took one final step, and as its cold, dark gaze locked with his, Evan felt something shift within him, as though he were being drawn into the earth itself. The forest's hum grew louder, a pulse that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. The stag's antlers, now impossibly close, glowed faintly, and Evan could feel the weight of the forest's secret press against his soul. And then, just as the world seemed to collapse into darkness, the stag turned, its long antlers brushing the fog aside, as if inviting him to follow. Evan didn't resist. He had no choice. The forest had claimed him, and there was no path to escape. Only the path of the stag remained. As the stag moved, its presence seemed to pull the fog with it, swirling the mist in unnatural patterns as it stepped gracefully through the forest. Evan followed, unable to stop himself, his body moving with a will of its own, as if the forest had taken hold of him completely. He felt a strange calm wash over him, despite the fear that gripped his chest. The world around him was shifting. Each step he took seemed to blur the lines between reality and something deeper, something that existed outside of time. The trees began to thin, and soon Evan found himself walking through an open glade, bathed in the dim, eerie light of the twilight. The stag stopped at the center of the clearing, its antlers stretching wide, casting long shadows across the ground. The forest seemed to grow silent in that moment, as though it, too, was holding its breath. Evan stood at the edge of the glade, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes fixed on the stag. For the first time since he had entered the forest, he was aware of the deep quiet that enveloped him. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves. It was as if time had stopped entirely, and the only movement was the slow, deliberate swaying of the stag's massive antlers. A strange sensation of weightlessness crept over Evan, and he felt as if he were no longer standing on solid ground but floating within the mist itself. His senses were heightened, his mind alert to every tiny shift in the air, the smallest movements in the fog. The stag's black eyes never left him, and he understood then that the creature wasn't simply watching him. It was waiting. Evan stepped forward, drawn in by an invisible force, his feet moving over the soft earth as if it were guiding him, as if the very ground had become an extension of his will. The stag remained still, its presence both overwhelming and strangely peaceful. As he approached, Evan noticed the markings on its body, subtle, almost imperceptible scars etched into its fur, patterns that seemed to tell stories of old battles, of storms weathered and past. The stag was not just a guardian, it was a part of the forest's memory, a keeper of its ancient history. He stopped a few feet away from the creature, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. The stag's eyes glimmered, and in them he saw something far beyond the simple reflection of himself. He saw the forest's heartbeat, its pulse, its existence, stretching back through centuries of life and death. The stag wasn't just part of the forest, it was the forest. It was a living embodiment of the natural world, its protector, and its witness to everything that had happened here. Evan's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He knew, deep down, that this was the moment. This was what he had been drawn to the forest for, the image he had wanted to capture. The moment that had been eluding him for so long was not a photograph of a rare animal, but the understanding of the forest itself. He was not meant to capture it. He was meant to experience it, to become part of its silent narrative. The stag took a slow, deliberate step toward him, and Evan felt his pulse quicken. The air around them seemed to thicken, pressing in on him from all sides. The forest had grown still, and the fog, now heavy and clinging to the ground like tendrils, seemed to envelop the entire clearing. The stag lowered its head slightly, its antlers nearly brushing the ground as if offering Evan something, an invitation or a gift. He felt an overwhelming compulsion to kneel, to lower himself to the earth as the stag had, and as he did, something shifted again, deeper this time. A rumble in the air, a vibration that felt like a distant thunderstorm approaching. The ground beneath him seemed to stir, and suddenly the mist parted in front of him, revealing a sight so surreal that Evan could hardly believe his eyes. In the center of the clearing, beneath the stag, there was a small pool of water. It was unlike any water Evan had ever seen. The surface shimmered with an ethereal glow, as though the light itself came from within. The air around it was filled with a soft, melodic hum, as though the water was singing a song no one had ever heard before, a song that resonated deep in his bones. The stag stepped closer, its hooves silent against the earth. It lowered its head to the pool, and Evan instinctively followed its movement, watching as the stag's antlers brushed the surface of the water. The moment they touched, the entire pool seemed to ripple, sending out concentric waves that disturbed the air itself. Evan felt something shift within him, something deep, something primordial. The hum of the water intensified, and suddenly he understood. The stag was not just a guardian, it was a bridge between the forest and something far older, something older than time itself. The water held the essence of the forest, its past, its present, its future. And through the stag, the forest was speaking to him. The fog grew heavier, the air colder, and Evan felt a pull deep within him. It was a pull to understand, to truly comprehend the forest's story. Not as an outsider, but as part of its very fabric. He wasn't meant to document it. He wasn't meant to understand it with his camera or his rational mind. The forest was asking him to be a part of it, to join in its eternal cycle. As he reached toward her,